If they were really Machiavellian, they would have McConnell freeze every other week. Just keep the issue of age front and center.
But no question, right? It's exactly what you do. I mean, I don't think that's what's actually happening.
Yeah, no, I don't think he's faking it. It looks pretty authentic. Ian, where does this podcast find you?
I'm on the West Coast, San Francisco.
What are you doing in the Bay Area?
A bunch of meetings. I was in New York for all that United Nations excitement last week, the whole world coming to us, which is always nice. And then I got out of Dodge.
So, all that excitement is somewhat relative, but nonetheless, we'll talk about the United Nations General Assembly that just took place in New York. You attended and wrote in your newsletter that the mood was bleak, though not defeatist. You also wrote that if the world had a CEO, they'd be fired. Tell us more about your observations.
Well, that seems pretty clear, right? I wrote about that specifically playing off what they call these Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, these 17 metrics that the United Nations has spent a lot of time working on that basically define together the state of human development. So education and poverty and, hunger. In other words, kind of good that the world comes together and figures out what do we want to see to ensure that the 8 billion people on the planet over time are actually doing better. It kind of makes sense, right? You sort of want someone defining that. And we're at the halfway mark of these SDGs that are supposed to hit their goals by 2030. About only 30% of them are remotely on track, and a lot of them are doing worse than they were when we started the process. So, I mean, just by self definition of the metrics that the UN is saying, and the world underneath the umbrella of the UN is saying, here's how we want to be judged. Here are our shareholder returns, if you will, but for the people and the governance on the planet, we're kind of failing. And so, yeah, I think we'd probably mix it up and change leadership. But of course, the world doesn't have a CEO, and that is part of the reason why we are facing the challenges that we have.
So, the I've always talked about, when I read, I forget his name, Thomas Pinkman or Steven Pinkman,
Steven
the
Pinker.
Harvard, yeah, Pinker, the Harvard guy that basically says we have a defeatist mentality and the cadence of the news cycle creates a negative outlook on the world. And if you look at abject poverty, if you look at more democracies versus autocracies, what what stood out in terms of the specific metrics that we're not making progress against?
Well, first of all, Stephen admitted to me that he has an intrinsic bias towards upside, which is great, but not analytically useful. I mean, I think it makes him a happier person, so I'm not opposed to it. But if we're trying to just have a conversation saying where do we think we're heading, you've got to take Pinker with a few grains of salt. And I give him credit for being willing to admit it, but still, it's a challenge. I would say there are a couple of things that I would focus on. First, the proximate that in the last 3 years, the combination of pandemic and the Russia war. Russia war, Ukraine, how many people care about Ukraine? Not all that many. How many people are affected by the food and fertilizer and supply chain disruptions as a consequence of Ukraine? And a lot. Like Ukraine matters a lot more than any conflict in sub Saharan Africa, any conflict in South or Southeast Asia to the poorest people in the world. Ukraine matters more to them because it's having such an impact. So you first of all, you take those two things, pandemic, massively disruptive, and Russia Ukraine war, massively disruptive for global supply chain economy, and that by itself has reversed the trajectory of what had been 50 years of unprecedented progress in human development. Basically, we got 5 years of regression in the last 3. And then secondly is the fact that we are increasingly facing the pushback from climate change and from the knock-on effects of climate change, which are expensive and disproportionately impact the poorest, disproportionately impact those that have not had the chance to industrialize and carbon emit, but they're the ones facing the most extreme temperature swings. They're the ones that are starving. They're the ones that are flooded out. They're the ones that are forced to move from their homes in largest numbers. So I would say those are the two biggest structural causes. And then you have just inadequate institutional response for big reasons. One, because the Chinese are so much more powerful, but are not trusted by the U.S. and American allies. So that creates a lot of conflict and inefficiency. And then also the fact that a lot of Western institutions, especially those in the United States, increasingly are seen as unrepresentative and illegitimate. And so our leaders are focusing much more inward. There's much more populism, there's much more anti establishment sentiment, but certainly much less willingness to act like global sheriff, architect of global trade, cheerleader of common global values. So I think if you were to put those things together, and I've got my geopolitics hat on, an economist would answer that question somewhat differently, but would still be talking about the same basic elephant. That's why things are now actually getting worse. That Pinker had been right for 50 years, Pinker is much less right today.
So I'll put forward a thesis, and you tell me where I have this right or wrong. And that is, the world is becoming more prosperous. Global GDP growth, while it's slow, is still positive. And the biggest nations, China's no longer growing 8%. I don't know if it's 3%, 0%. The US, while unremarkable, the growth has been steady and consistent. Markets are up in the US. We have a lot of prosperity. The majority of that prosperity is crowded in the top 1%. And the things that really ail us, polarization, climate change, food and energy and supply chain interruptions, quite frankly, don't impact the 1%. And that the life is so nice, the ability of kind of the 1% to sequester themselves from what are the biggest problems facing us. In addition, these problems are like creeping takeovers. They're not going to end the world in the next 3 years. It might be probably not even the next 30, but definitely possibly the next 50 or 100. And then when you couple the ability of the people who are in charge, who tend to be the wealthiest, who have recognized unbelievable prosperity and can shelter themselves and ring fence all of these problems, that the people who are in charge have never done better. And so the motivation or the impetus to address these challenges just doesn't affect the people who would be responsible for catalyzing a change. That was a bit of a word salad, but you get where I'm
Yeah,
going.
absolutely. Do I think you're right on that? I think you're absolutely right on that, Scott. I think it first of all, what I like about the analysis is it's always it feels better when the analysis actually matches with some level of empathy. I think the response to that is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people whose view is we want to burn it down as a consequence. Why is Biden and Trump both going? Why are they both going to Michigan right now? And it's because they want to paint themselves as being the champions of precisely those people.
Yeah, the
Those
working man.
people,
Yeah.
exactly. And for different reasons, both are inappropriate to be embraced by them, but both have arguments that will resonate and will land. I think it's interesting that so much of populism today is about politicians trying to find issues that don't address inequality, but will allow them to continue to promote themselves, their buddies, and their networked elites. So, I mean, let's not talk about class warfare. Let's talk about identity politics because, that'll get people all ginned up, but won't force us to pay taxes, right? I think there's a lot of that. And certainly in the United States, where we have a level of economic collapse for the lowest classes, the lower and middle classes for the last 40 years minimum. We have, I mean, stagnation, which feels like collapse to them, I should say. I mean, these are not poor people in the global scheme of things at all, and made much worse by the inflation levels that we see right now. And those inflation levels have come down, but that doesn't mean prices are going down. That just means they aren't going up as fast as they were last year. So it's not like the people that are still making 15 or 20 or 25 bucks an hour suddenly feel like they can pay for stuff. Absolutely not. And you see that in the poll numbers. Then you have the United States as, the country that most lionizes entrepreneurs, individualists, people that build things themselves, which is fantastic for your and my personal background and trajectory, but also means the family's eroding, the church is eroding, community groups are eroding. So many of the places that allowed people to feel like they were part of the fabric of something that would look out for them, take care of them, engage with them, those things increasingly don't exist. Instead, you're intermediated through your phone. And then finally, of course, the role of uh, a much more polarized and fragmented media space, and now social media space, and now algorithmic AI space. I think if you layer those three things on top of each other, I'm not going to suggest what percentage each have in terms of responsibility for this new malaise that so many Americans are feeling, and this anger that so many Americans are expressing. And it's not just white undereducated men. I mean, it's much broader than that. I think that you really do engulf the problem. And the fact that this has been growing for decades means that even if you start to fix it, it's not going to get fixed in one electoral cycle. I don't care who you elect.
So let's do a whirlwind. Let's go around the world. So give us your thoughts in terms of the situation and how it's evolved or devolved in Ukraine since the last time we spoke.
Well, the the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has gone at best marginally well for the Ukrainians. And Zelensky, who was just in the United States and Canada a week ago, probably had his most difficult foreign trip since the war started. You
Definitely his
saw that
coldest reception.
Yeah, well, you saw that McCarthy was not willing to grant him a joint appearance of Congress, was not willing to have the Biden administration do a full briefing for the House the way they had for the Senate. I think McCarthy was doing Zelensky a favor. Honestly, I think that if he had done either of those things, there would have been many more headlines from a skeptical right wing of the GOP party yelling and screaming that we shouldn't be spending this money anymore. I don't think he was undermining Zelensky at all. I just think he's in a very difficult position, but that difficulty is going to grow. Zelensky was told by the White House that you cannot count on military support for a second counteroffensive next year, which means that increasingly the land that Ukraine has is kind of the land they have for the foreseeable future. Like their ability to retake everything that Russia has taken, and they have every right to do so, every right to want to do so, but it doesn't look like they're going to have the capacity. So that's one very serious problem for Zelensky and for NATO. At the same time, we see that Ukraine is increasingly engaging in drone and missile strikes, not just on the front lines, but into Crimea, into Sevastopol, where the Black Sea Fleet is based, into their headquarters, into Moscow, into Russia proper. They're putting what will soon be over $1 billion into their drone industry. They're going to become one of the top drone producers in the world. They will not be restrained by NATO in how and where they use those drones. And that is bringing the war increasingly to Russia itself. Now, the Ukrainians thus far are striking almost uniquely military targets. The Russians thus far are striking mostly infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, and civilians indiscriminately, but no guarantees that's going to continue. And I guess what I'm saying is none of this looks particularly sustainable. I mean, you look at the last 6 months and the front lines in the war are where they've been. The Russians have 18% of Ukrainian territory. That's more or less been true for 6 months. But the nature of the war and the context is actually changing quite a bit.
So if you had to, and recognizing nobody knows, but if you were forced to guess or speculate, what does the conflict look like in 12 or 24 months from now? What would you posit?
Well, so you said, given the fact that I don't know, so let's look at, I agree with you, I don't know, but let's at least look at why I don't know. One of the biggest reasons why I don't know is because I don't know who the American president's going to be. And
Yeah, that's the swing, isn't it?
The United States has been providing a strong majority of all the military support, training, and intelligence that the Ukrainians have. If Trump becomes president, leaving aside the fact that he has promised that he will end the war within his first 24 hours, which seems long for Trump, but nonetheless, leave that aside. The policy on Russia, Ukraine, and the support for Ukraine will change almost 180 degrees overnight. That's really interesting because a lot of people, I mean, I've spoken last week, I spoke with at least 6 European leaders, like presidents, prime ministers of their countries, and they were all increasingly and very seriously focused and concerned about that issue. And what's interesting is it's making them feel if the window is closing on potential support from Ukraine from the US, and they know that like they're not going to be able to make up the gap. Like, I mean, if the US goes away, the Europeans aren't going to be able to suddenly continue to provide that military support. So their view increasingly, not the Germans, but the rest of the Europeans I've talked to pretty much, the French, the UK, the Poles, the Nordics, the Balts, their view is that you've got to bring Ukraine fully into NATO before that happens. Now, right now, Biden and the Germans don't support that, worry that it's too confrontational. It pushes the Russians too hard, though they're less worried about that given how Russian, bluster hasn't played out over the past months. Too concerned the Ukrainians can't be trusted. I mean, lots of issues there, but that is now becoming a much more active dynamic in the intra NATO conversations. Again, there's a big danger here, Scott. I think one of the things that we can fairly say, looking 12, 24 months out, I think if we look back, we are likely to say that where we are right now is peak NATO. It's peak transatlanticism. It's incredible coordination between the US, all the Europeans, and the Ukrainians. It's going to be increasingly very challenging to maintain that.
How would you describe our relationship with China? Is it getting cooler? Is it thawing?
I would say that it is poor. It lacks trust. It has the speed of its decline has diminished. And I mean, so like for the media companies in the US, that sounds like the new up. Your rate of decline is reduced, right? I guess that's positive. Um, it is clear that Xi Jinping and Biden are now putting a lot of work into a bilateral summit that will occur only a few miles from where I am right now in San Francisco in November. By the way, historically, when you look at U.S. China summit meetings, the most stable time in the relationship is not after the summit. It's before the summit. It's right now. It's when both sides are preparing for the summit. So they're spending all of this time making sure nothing goes wrong, talking about, what they can announce, how they can gauge, what are the things that'll be fruitful, what they can talk about, right? So the next 2 months of US China relations, I would suggest, are likely to be among the most stable that we've had. And then after the summit's over, you'll get a honeymoon effect for a few weeks. It ain't going to last very long. It'll be like the next time that Congress, sort of lobs a piece of legislation. The next time someone big goes to Taiwan, the Taiwanese elections are January 13th. Certainly, assuming that the nationalist vice president wins, that's going to be more problematic. So, no, it's a poor relationship, but both leaders right now are trying to stabilize it, and they're having some level of success. The biggest announcements in the last few weeks have been these new bilateral channels for engagement through the State Department, through Commerce, and most recently through Treasury. Nothing that's going to knock your socks off, Scott, nothing that's going to make big headlines, but does help to normalize the high level engagement between the governments.
I was asked to mediate or help unwind a business from two owners. And I looked at the business and got to understand it. And my conclusion was I sat them down and said, figure it out and make up. There's just no way to unwind this business without you both losing 90% of everything. And so figure it out. And I feel that that is somewhat analogous to the relationship between China and the US. And that is the biggest tax increase or tax cut is a function of the US and China uh, not getting along or getting along. It seems to me that they have such a mutual interest in trying to figure out not great relations, but at least good relations. What do you think the real soft tissue here, the issues that separate the two from what feels like a real, you know, vested mutual interest?
Well, one is that the level of mutuality has been eroding for a few reasons. One is that China, when the Americans were bringing the Chinese into the World Trade Organization and opening that market, China had just an unprecedented amount of hardworking, inexpensive labor. That labor is now more expensive than Mexico. It is highly competitive, and local Chinese firms are fighting for it, and they don't have rule of law. So China as the factory for the world is increasingly not a useful analogy. A lot of companies want China to be the factory for Chinese consumption, Chinese demand. China for China is what that's being called. Um, but but it's a very different model than what was driving China in globalization. There's this term of art that you hear everyone talk about, the Europeans, von der Leyen, Biden, others de-risking. Well, this is a de-risking that makes the interdependence between the two countries less deep, less all-encompassing. Then you have the fact that some of the American companies that are driving the indices, your Metas, your Googles, your Microsofts have either no or virtually no access to the Chinese market. China doesn't let them in. And so, the Americans say, well, we might not let TikTok and the teenagers go crazy. I don't think TikTok is a national security concern personally, at least no more than I think that having kids on Facebook or Instagram is a national security concern. They both are. Um, but but if the Chinese aren't going to let American companies in, why should we let Chinese social media companies in? I mean, because we want to do more damage to our own children? Like that doesn't seem fair. So there's that. And there's also just this, the fact that the Chinese economy right now is seriously and structurally underperforming on the back of over 2 years where no one traveled to China. And so a lot of companies, the U.S., the AmCham in China just did a survey of all of the corporates there, and only 50% said that they might be interested in investing more in the next 5 years. That's the lowest response on record from the Americans. The Europeans are a little bit more optimistic, but not radically more optimistic. China's now, they say they're growing at 4 to 5%. In reality, it's a lot lower than that. The real estate sector is really sucking wind and could implode at any moment. Lots of unsustainable corporate debt, demographics really challenging. And the Chinese are focusing more on China. They've made it hard for a lot of foreign companies. You see this Nomura exec that has just been, detained, is kept in China. You've seen investigations into American companies, European companies suddenly getting raided. I mean, all of these things together, I still am a firm believer in everything that you said, that the US and China have far more reasons to get along than not. That the only thing worse for America than China succeeding is China imploding. China imploding would be very bad for the global economy, very bad for the United States, very bad for American consumers. We don't want that. But the level of interdependence is not what it was 10 years ago. and it's trending faster in that direction.
And before we talk about AI, I just want to get your take on the political situation and the state of affairs in the U.S. Any thoughts on? I mean, since we last talked, it just seems we're starting to normalize the notion that Trump's going to be the nominee and that he could be president again, which just seems almost unbelievable to me. What are your thoughts?
Well, it would be unbelievable if it hadn't already happened once. Once it
Right.
already happens once, you kind of think it can happen again, right? I mean, those
Yeah, but
people are.
It's one thing to elect a talk show host. It's another thing to elect a talk show host who's also an insurrectionist. I mean, this really is taking it up a notch.
I mean, I would argue that what was being elected was a grievance based campaign, incredibly hostile to all of the enemies of these people, incredibly hostile to the establishment, irrespective of the fact that he's part of it and has profited from it and all that stuff. But I mean, the fact is that he was driving them crazy, the mainstream media, increasingly like the university professors, the doctors, the scientists, all of these people. Trump is the one that's going to stick the middle finger to those people. And the fact that, he's now been impeached twice, um, acquitted twice, 91 indictments. And by the way, if they don't vote him in, if his party faithful don't vote him in, he could face jail time. So look what he's willing to do. Look what he's willing to go through just to stick it to the man, right? And I mean, if that's why he was voted in the first time, he's only given all those people far more reasons to vote for him a second time. So very clearly, I think we all should be betting on him being the nominee. Can he win as president? I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know if it's 50% likely or 30% likely, but it ain't 10%. Not against Biden, where a strong majority of the entire population believes that he's too old to run. And, he's not doing well on immigration now at all, which is a serious issue that affects every American. I mean, even the New York mayor was taking, pot shots at the president, not exactly a red bastion, on that front. And on the economy, while I'm sympathetic to the fact that the economy is doing considerably better than that of other advanced industrial economies coming out of the pandemic and the Russia war. So, I mean, if you were looking at Germany, France, the UK, Japan, Canada. I mean, you bet on the United States. So you have to say the US is doing something right from a policy perspective. But a lot of Americans are hurting. And I do put stock in the fact that the average American in that context is going to blame the incumbent. Not that they think that Trump has done anything right, but that they're more willing to stick a finger to whoever's in charge. And so, if that persists, and one thing I can predict pretty strongly is that in 14 months, Biden will be 14 months older. So that right. So that dynamic is not getting better. And I mean, you saw the New Yorker
And
cover
it doesn't
coming out with
decline.
look, the
Do you have
four
parents?
aged.
The cognitive decline is not linear. I mean, it starts to decline faster and faster. Let me ask you this: do you think there's a chance that Democrats might, if there's an incident, he falls or his popularity continues to wane? Do you think there's a chance, or is it too late that the Democrats prop up someone else?
Well, first of all, I think there is no plan B. Right now, there is no plan B. So there's no one around Biden that is saying, okay, if something happens, who are we going to go for? In part because the person that is obvious they would go for is not electable, is the vice president. And maybe that's fair, maybe that's not fair, but it is a reality that is accepted in Biden land. So right now, there is no such conversation happening. Biden is absolutely running, but the McConnell episodes have now made this much more front and present for the American public. And people calling for McConnell to step down. McConnell's doing the Republicans a great service in continuing to govern in his incapacity because it just makes the age issue of Biden more salient.
I was. It's so funny you said that. I thought that if they were really Machiavellian, they would have McConnell freeze every other week
And no question,
and
right? That's exactly what
just
you
keep the
do.
issue of age front and center.
Yep. I mean,
What about?
I don't think that's what's actually happening,
Yeah,
but
no, I don't. I don't think he's faking it. It looks
yeah.
pretty
Although,
authentic.
I mean, let's be clear. I mean, we could probably get this to trend on X. I mean, I don't know. Are you back on, by the way?
I'm almost 90 days Twitter sober. I've just decided I'm not going to paint this guy's fucking fence.
No, no, I understand
I
that, but have they allowed you? Because you were thrown off
oh
the
yeah, as soon as I went public with not being able to get back on, to someone's credit, I did hear that day from Twitter saying this is how you get back on. I didn't do it. Anyways, let's talk about AI. In your article with Mustafa Suleiman for Foreign Affairs, you wrote, open quote, whether they admit it or not, AI's creators are themselves geopolitical actors, and their sovereignty over AI further entrenches the emerging technopolar order, one in which technology companies wield the kind of power in their domains once reserved for nation states. Let's unpack this. How do you think AI will influence geopolitics?
well, at the when you started talking to me about Russia, Ukraine, and China, I mean, we think we're having a conversation about the future of the world. And of course, that means we're talking about governments and political leaders that are elected or that are dictators, and we kind of understand that. And that's been the that's been the framework for our entire lives. Um, Increasingly, if we're talking about anything that affects the digital world and what the digital world touches and can affect, which includes our behavior, our spending, big pieces of the global economy, and big pieces of national security. We're not talking about countries anymore. We're talking about companies and we're talking about individuals. So, in other words, the future, we talked, there's going to be a China century or there's Pax Americana, it's a G2, it's a multipolar world. No, a technopolar world is that part of the world, the digital order, that is run by technology companies and individuals that act as sovereigns. That Elon decides whether or not the Ukrainians have the ability to fight in certain places because he does or does not turn on or off Starlink for those soldiers. That Microsoft decides whether they are providing cyber defenses and securities for countries, not just companies and individuals that are attacked. That AI companies will decide what AI can do, who can use it, how they can use it, how they're platformed, what their political orientation will or will not be. These things are all completely different than how we think about geopolitics. And if you believe, as I do, and as my friend and co author Mustafa Suleiman does, if you believe that AI is going to transform the way all of us behave on this planet, the fact that governments have so far almost zero say in that, almost none of the resources, almost none of the understanding, that implies that we need to start thinking of these technology companies as geopolitical actors.
So I would push back in the sense that, is as much that we get wrong at a government level, whether it's the FBI or NATO or our security apparatus or our Defense Department, the the vast majority of the people in there, they're serving as fiduciaries for the Constitution and American citizens. And I don't like the idea of normalizing that Elon Musk and Satya Nadella and Sam Altman get a seat at the table because they have invented these incredible technologies. I like the idea of passing laws that say if your technologies end up having an impact and domain over battlefield technologies, congratulations, well done. We now get to make those decisions. And if you don't give us real time information such that we can make those decisions, we're going to start putting people in jail. I would go the other way. Your thoughts?
Well, first of
Is
all,
that naive?
I no, not naive at all. I share your views. And certainly with the Starlink case, you've now seen that Elon is developing a new technology that he's going to give to the US government, and the Chinese government presumably won't have it, and the Russians won't have it, and NATO will make those decisions. So on that specific issue, your concerns, my concerns are being addressed, and hopefully that will mean that the tech companies are not making those decisions of life and death. Um, when we talk specifically about AI, I think that we are moving way too fast for governments to be able to do that principally. But I agree with you. I don't think the technology companies, they don't have the interest, they don't have the background, they don't have the experience, nor are they accountable to make those decisions themselves. So what I'm suggesting is that they're going to have to do it together. And we see this already start happening in the United States approach. You saw that the White House invited those 7 companies that are dominating the AI landscape to come in and say, okay, let's have some initial agreements on things like red teaming, areas of potential malfeasance, or breaking your models and sharing that information with the government and with each other. Let's have, watermarking on AI that ensures that people know what is and what is not an image, a sound, a whatever video generated by AI. The companies all agreed to do it. We don't yet have legislation for it, and they're working with the US. That strikes me as the kind of hybrid model that is more likely to succeed. For me, AI is becoming more like the global financial markets, where we all know we need the financial markets. We also know that that any in market player that potentially can start a run can have knock-on cascading effects that can bring the markets down. And therefore, we need macro prudential reform. We need to have organizations like the Bank of International Settlements. We need the Financial Stability Board that brings together all the financial players and the governments to make sure that if there's a crisis, if there's a crash, that we keep the system working. I think that's what we're going to need in AI, which means this is not a US versus China Cold War, because the Americans and the Chinese aren't going to dominate AI the way they dominate, say, semiconductors, right? Or the way they dominate, 5G. The AI is going to be systemic. It's going to be proliferated everywhere. Everyone's going to have access to it. And we're going to need it to work, to be available, but also not to destroy us. And that's something that, frankly, I mean, you and I talked about how the Americans and Chinese need each other. This is an area in actually fascinatingly where we don't know it yet. We don't recognize it yet. But within 5, 10 years, US and China will fundamentally need each other on this issue.
Ian Bremmer is the president and founder of Eurasia Group, the world's leading political risk research and consulting firm, and G0 Media, a company dedicated to providing intelligent and engaging coverage of international affairs. Author of numerous books. What's your most recent book, Ian?
Power of Crisis.
The Power of Crisis. There you go.
New
And
York
most importantly,
Times best-selling. Yeah.
Go on. Well
Yeah.
done. And most importantly, this marks his 8th appearance on the Prop G Pod.
Most
As always,
importantly,
Ian,
and I enjoy it
right.
every single time. It's always great to
number
see you.
8. Number 8. Great to see you, Ian. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.